run into the presentation. Cool. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. As you guys know, it's the 1-year anniversary of Drupal Nights. So a year ago this month, we started with the vision to do Drupal Nights. So we all know what it is. It's a bunch of great presentations we put online. But why are we doing it? We decided we really wanted to foster an open conversation between developers. We try to do this, within our team. But what if we opened it up to the people in the area? People asking questions always helps you learn new things. We'd like to share things. We know some cool stuff. You know some cool stuff. We like to learn things as well. And it's really important, too, to create a strong community ties. And this is one of the ways that BioRAFT chooses to give back to the Drupal community. Another reason, not so altruistic, we're also hiring. So it's a great way to get our name out as a really great place to work because you can see that we value the Drupal community, we value quality in our code and our practices as well. So a year ago, Danny Norden was standing in front right here, and she gave a great presentation on user research for the web and applications. It was our very, very first one. And then Steph came along and started talking to us about keeping our site secure. I'm going to give Steph an opportunity to tell us a little bit about that presentation.
All right. Hi, I'm Stéphane Corlosquet. I work for Acquia, and I came here to talk about security and Drupal. So the topics I covered include how to first make sure your server and all your hosting infrastructure is secure before even thinking of your site. So then it comes site configuration and site management, how to make sure your site is well configured and doesn't have any kind of open hole letting hackers in. I also talked about the process, how to see the security process not just as a one-time fix when you launch, but as a constant maintenance process. So it's good to keep that in mind when you're planning your project and budgeting and everything. I also talked about the best practices for developers, all the APIs, all the tips and tricks for keeping essentially your site secure.
Thank you. In September, Ed talked about blending distributions in order to make custom websites. I'll let him tell us a little bit about that presentation.
Well, I think it's a really important topic. Just to start working with the distributions that are already out there, because there's so much talent that goes into them. The White House is available as an open public distribution. Berkeley's distribution is available as open academic, open academy, and they're just brilliant bases for building other websites. And you can take them apart and you can rebuild them. So you have a very consistent platform to build your own sites out of, and you just keep iterating it to build more sites out of the same base. They become easier to maintain and easier to spit out new ones. So just use what's already out there and just adapt it to your own purposes. I think that's a Drupal spirit.
Cool, thanks, Ed. Jesse Beach joined us in October talking about the semantic application layer and accessibility. It was a really awesome presentation talking about how the HTML that you're putting into your code can really make a difference for people using screen readers and other devices. Jason Pimentel, think responsibly and design responsibly. That was our presentation in November. A lot of people are moving towards responsive designs as opposed to having a desktop and a mobile layout. And he was talking about how to bring all that together. Seth talked about BHAT in December. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that presentation, Seth?
Sure. So the thing I like most about BHAT is that it makes testing about how you're building your website. And the nice thing about looking back on it now is I gave that talk in December of 2013, and BHAT wasn't on anybody's radar. And since then, it's become clear it's on a lot of people's radar. So it was a really nice validation that there was something major here that we should be looking at that I think is going to change the way people develop websites in the future, which is that behavior-driven testing approach. So.
Excellent, thank you. We did a panel on high performance Drupal in January. We've got both Eric and Chris up here. So started off with what the performance was about.
So I wasn't here, so these are the people who saved my butt. when I couldn't make it, I was probably the sickest I had been in 6 years. But the fundamental idea of the presentation was, like Ed said, standing on the shoulders of giants. There's an amazing Drupal performance book out there by the folks at Tag One Consulting. And it covers the whole gamut of what you want to look at when you're looking at performance on your Drupal site, from the low-hanging fruit and what you can check off through the UI all the way to setting up high availability clustering and web farms and heartbeats and failover and the infrastructure and everything in between. So it was intended as sort of a cursory talk of all performance topics. Right.
Eric, anything you want to add to that?
We actually went into that, and then a lot of the conversation turned towards practical applications for it. And I think it was good because it was a lot of Q&A in that session about what we've actually seen and what has worked and what doesn't work, for individual types of sites, to try and keep them as fast as possible, and whether it's worth the effort sometimes, because faster is, more scalable and more secure is not necessarily faster, and you have to pit one against the other sometimes. So.
Awesome. Patrick also was on the panel, as well as Mickey. Either of you want to add more to that topic?
Well, I'd just add that there were, if you look at the presentation on the video, there's some great links in there to resources to help you test your site as it is now and help you improve it. And these guys are fantastically knowledgeable. I love that.
Yeah, I think one of the things we kind of understood with it was that there's a huge portion of this that we just didn't get to, which is a lot of like front end performance and then the back end database performance. And so I think we just talked about the opportunity for maybe future sessions and doing something a little more specific for performance. But yeah.
Cool. To date, this video on YouTube, out of our whole series of videos, is the most watched video. So it was a very, very successful presentation. Kay Van Valkenburg talked to us about client training rollouts using personas. His presentation was about, great, you've got this website. You can't just hand it to your client and say, good luck with it. You need to figure out who they are, what their role is in using the website. Are they a full admin? Are they someone with lesser permissions? And train them to use the site to have successful adoption within the organization. Ben Melanson talked about powering your API with Drupal 8. It was a really great eye-opener. Things coming down the pipe with Drupal 8. Obviously, a lot of times we talk about Drupal 7 stuff still, but there's some new features, and he talked about those. Nick, why don't you tell us about using Drupal as a platform?
Yeah, so glad to be back. My talk was a bit of a counterpoint to Ed's talk. So one of the reasons why we use Drupal is because it solves a lot of the problems that have been solved in the web for a while. One of the reasons why people use distributions is because they solve a lot of problems really well. Like for Open Academic, they have a lot of the stuff that an educational firm will need in order to serve their students or faculty. But what happens when you need to build a site for yourself that needs to be repeatable? You need to have the same features. You need to be able to control upgrades. You need to be able to support 30, 40, 100, 1,000 different websites and not have 1,000 different websites, be able to support them in the same manner. So when you are approaching building a website, a lot of people are used to that. But when you start approaching building a system, it's a very different process. So I talked a little bit about that. And there's actually some really new, interesting stuff coming out in that field that hopefully maybe I can talk a little bit about today too.
Thank you. Chris Placus talked about accelerate Drupal development by getting off the island. Right now he's focusing a lot on the other tools outside of Drupal and how to maximize being able to use those within Drupal. So the presentation really was about Composer. It was absolutely fabulous, very eye-opening on how you can incorporate some object-orientedness into your Drupal 7 site as well. Mickey, tell us about Voipdrupal.
Voipdrupal, it's an underrated suite of modules for Drupal that allow your website to interact with a regular telephone. not just a smartphone. And of course, there's 5.6 billion people in the world with regular phones and only a couple of 100 million with smartphones. So you could essentially develop a site where people did not even know there was a website. It could just have a telephone number, and the VoIP service can read your nodes to people. You can have people sign up for events with their telephone. We're developing a platform called power2connect.org based on this. Mainly we came up with it for BOFs, birds of a feather sessions for Drupal, so that people could have them on the fly and register with a phone number. The best thing about the suite of modules is it installs in about 20 minutes and has some sample scripts that you can use right out of the box. So you could have a conferencing system or voice recorded messages, etc. And it's from the MIT Civic Media Center.
Awesome, thank you. And that brings us to tonight, our 13th presentation, Ask the Experts. Not only do we have a panel in front of the camera, we also have people scattered throughout the audience who can facilitate discussions and answer some of those questions you've got going on. So, without further ado, I'm actually going to put Ed on the spot. The reason this idea came about is at one of our Drupal nights a couple months ago, we were all just talking with each other around the table, eating our pizza, and Ed's like, you know what would be really good? If I had a place where I could just ask some questions, you know, some off the wall, some silly, you know. If you go to some meetups, they're massive, you know. There's like an audience. You can't just ask a one-off question, or you're coming to a meetup and it's a presentation and it's very, very formal feeling. So I want to provide an opportunity and a forum for people to ask silly questions, things they don't understand about the community, have a concept, high-level concept about hooks maybe explained in another way that you've never had opportunity before. So I do recall, Ed, the question you asked that night was, gosh, Drupal uses a lot of odd terminology and jargon to describe the different functions of individuals who participate in making a website happen. And your question was, well, what are all of those, and what are the confusion between some of them? Do some of those, what is a developer? Is a developer different than someone who's a site builder versus a module developer? So that's the question I want to kick this conversation off with, was Ed's question, is tell me what you guys think, the different skill sets maybe that are required to take a site from conception to launch. And are there titles or labels that you can apply to those skill sets? And how does Drupal use those?
And how much does each pay?
How much do you need it?
So you've got, I'll just start. You've got a lot of developer titles that use the word developer, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of people, you know, if it's not confusion to you, it's confusion when you tell somebody else, because no two people all talk about them the same way. But we talk about front-end developers and back-end developers, and then there's DevOps and database administrators. Is how does that differ from DevOps? So, and front-end developers, is that different than somebody who's using Drupal to build a website? So I think the key is that it depends on what kind of site you're building and how much of the pre-made stuff you're using. So how much are you actually building versus how much are you assembling? So developer often, to me, invokes the term of like code. Like you're going to be writing either JavaScript, HTML, or PHP, at some level. Whereas a builder, are the people who take all of that, use Drupal for what it is, and actually build the website. So a site builder I like to think of as the person who's saying this block should be over here and using the Drupal interface to actually do those kinds of things. Whereas the developer is the one who do the same functionality but maybe do it in code instead of in the UI. And there are good reasons to do it both ways.
It's so funny because I think of developer as that entire umbrella, and a site builder is a specific kind of developer. A themer is a specific kind of developer. A skinner, which I think is someone who only does CSS. is a special kind of developer.
So what's the difference? I'll put this to you because I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear your description. What's the difference between a skinner and a themer?
A skinner only does CSS, and they may be learning how to work with changing HTML in a template, but a themer is something to me that's very, very Drupal specific. It's not, whereas a skinner could be any sort of platform, but a themer is someone that can go in and actually go into the template.php file and take an array of variables and do something with them, change them, and send more or less to the template. So they actually have quite a bit of knowledge of PHP skills and what's actually available to them in the variables for those templates.
So where does a front-end developer fit into that?
A front-end developer, in my opinion, this is all really weird, includes
Yeah.
a themer, a skinner, and potentially even a site builder, because a site builder spends quite a bit of time potentially in display suite module configurations, in context or block layouts and things, and they are presenting things to the front end as well.
I have this sort of tied-in assumption that when you say front-end developer, you're also probably going to be doing JavaScript.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
JavaScript.
Really?
JavaScript
And
is
accessibility maybe? Possibly, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that this is what really speaks to it, is that one of the reasons why it's so difficult to define is Drupal makes it very easy to cross
Those
paths.
lines, yes.
On any given day, I might sit down and apply a patch to a module. So you're using Git, you're using command line, you're using that kind of stuff, which is developer centric. You might be writing a pre-process function in the theme, and then you might be using Sass to compile CSS. You know, CSS really isn't. I mean, Sass. Sass isn't, a programming language, but it has variables. So it's very difficult. And I think the confusion isn't so much in the Drupal community; it's when you go outside the Drupal community. Like a lot of developers, you could a Drupal-specific agency will hire a Drupal developer and find out that they write a couple modules maybe, but they're not too comfortable. But they do a lot of configuration and they can write themes. They'll be happy with that. But then if that same person was hired as a developer at a non-Drupal shop, and they'd say, okay, you need to sit down and write some .NET or you need to write some PHP, and they'd sit there and go, I don't know what I'm doing. They would be very angry. And you see some of that on the web when somebody says I'm a developer and I do Drupal, and you're not a developer. But I would disagree, because I think the definition of developer is somebody who's developing sites. You're taking an idea. Yeah, you're taking an idea and producing a website.
You're making something from nothing.
It doesn't mean coder necessarily.
Yeah. And I think the whole question gets begged because of the way that the web has evolved, the Drupal has evolved, the Drupal community has evolved, because we didn't even have this question 6 or 7 years ago. I didn't even know what to put on my business card. I put web developer because I'm like, well, that's close enough because I do everything, but I maintain the servers. And I think that the industry has grown in that same way. That people who sort of got into Drupal early dabbled in everything.
Yes.
And the fact that we're moving into now, even Drupal 8's architecture lends itself towards separating presentation from code. And if you look at Drupal 4.7, it's like, here's your PHP in your front-end markup. The architecture of Drupal is segregating, and these roles are segregating. It's happening. It's evolving, and it's become that.
So maybe the real question really is not what do we call these things, but what are actually the skills needed? And someone could have a label of anything, but it's certain skills that you need.
I find this already incredibly helpful, even with this. I find this really helpful. But Steph and Nick, before you went to Acquia, you were basically working by yourself, building complicated sites. And Nick, you did the same thing when you took on large-scale projects. And it's that system, when you're not part of a larger team, when these issues become life and death, because suddenly you hit a wall, and you don't even know the language for the wall that you hit, and you don't know where to get help for that wall. I feel like that wall is defining my life.
Well, there's also a skill, and you hit the nail here, the skill of knowing where to find help or where to find the answer to your question.
Yes.
So you might not know the answer,
It's
but
very
you know where to go
embarrassing
look
to
for
even
it.
ask the question. I'm
Well,
like some mortified.
But
to
that's
say,
where the community comes in there, because you have connections in the community. You're maybe talking about the thing you're stuck on, and someone says,
You
I
have
know
to do
someone
it at a
just wrote
BioRAFT
this.
Drupal Nights.
Right, yes.
This is why we're here. We're answering this
Yeah.
question right
Live on
now.
camera.
But to be not flippant about it, it's what the user group should be doing. And what I've
Yes.
always struggled with, for those of you who don't know, there's a monthly meetup in Cambridge at MIT that's called the Boston User Group, Boston Area Drupal User Group. I don't even know what we call it, but and it's supposed to be a forum where people can come and talk about Drupal at any level. So like this, but also with problems they have, with silly questions they've got, with something that error message that they don't know how to back debug, and it's hard in an area like Cambridge and Boston where there are so many senior experienced Drupalists to come out and say, I don't know what this PHP warning means.
Right.
Because somebody's going to be, you're afraid that somebody's going to be offhandedly flippant and say, well, you just haven't set something right, go look, why don't you Google that, because you should be able to figure it out yourself. And I hope that doesn't happen, and if it does, we should talk about it. But it's also the kind of thing where you should then say, okay, great, now I know what to Google, and maybe I can go solve that. But I'd love to see more people asking that.
Well, there's a spin-up group called the Self-Help Group out of Arlington that meets once a month as well for this specific purpose.
So Mark, a gentleman named Mark from the Boston area group, started another group in Arlington that he wanted to call the Self-Help Group so that people could come and not feel embarrassed about it. And honestly, I went to probably the second or third one, and there were 12 people sitting around a table asking each other questions, and none of them had any answers because nobody knew. So it's that balance that we have to get where those of us who are experienced get back to, into these groups and actually ask. And I've talked with Mark a lot about this, that it's a great style of group, and you have to be able to, in some ways, have both, because we also don't want to have the people who are talking about the future of Drupal and the really, deep in things feel like there's nowhere for them to bounce ideas and talk off as well. Personally, when I started in Drupal, I didn't really have much of a PHP background, and I came to the Boston meetups, because we were starting to use it in our work, and I was totally lost. And the best decision I ever made.
And then you came back on Monday.
No,
pro.
no, it seems like it, but no. I was totally lost. But the thing is that I just kept coming, and I kept going, and I kept listening, and I kept learning, and then eventually, a couple months in, you get various levels of Drupal aha moments, where you're like, now I realize why menu is such a nightmare, or why something works the way it does, because that last piece fits in, and you're like, oh, I get it. And to be honest, happened to me this morning. There's pieces of all of this that just make sense at a different level the more you know. And that's probably the hardest thing. Like you were saying, that when you're alone in a shop, you have to know everything, but you can't. You can't know everything. And it's growing so fast that you'll never know anything. It's like being a mathematician, as was my training. And there's, back in the 1200s, or when the famous mathematicians were doing such amazing stuff that we all know about, it was because there was a finite amount of math that you could physically learn it all. And now it's not even possible in any discipline to be able to know everything about it. So you have to pick your battles. And often you either have to pick your battles about learning the surface of everything or becoming a specialist in something.
Well, the point is not to know everything, but to know where to find the answer.
Yeah.
And I agree with Eric about the user group should really be the place to do that. And it's important that people make suggestions to, like, the Drupal Association and such like that, to try and make these areas of the Drupal site more usable and more beneficial to new people and older people. And I had a suggestion for a friend finder thing that could match people up with the same or different skills. Like if you're looking, you have these certain skills. I don't even think it lists on our profiles what our skills are, or
you can put it on, but there's no way to search it.
Yeah, there's no real searchable, usable way for that. So if we had a way to list our skills and search for other skills we needed, that would just be a huge advantage for the community.
Is there a schema.org for skills?
Well, for job,
There's something.
job
And they're
offers,
also rebuilding the profiles for
Yes,
Drupal.org
Danny's
now.
rebuilding the
They can
profiles.
finally search
Finally.
Yeah, but-
username.
Yes.
Even if
One of
you-
I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that the community's gotten so much bigger.
Yeah, huge.
And I remember when it used to be possible to follow along with the module release list.
Oh, yeah.
It used to be a joke between Michelle and myself of, oh yeah, there was a module for that, and it was released yesterday,
Yes.
because you could follow that. And now it's at the point where that's not possible to do for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Some of it's the decentralization, but some of it's just the community's gotten that much bigger.
or the
And I think
duplication
we're
of
still-
modules too.
We're
Yes.
still seeing the growing pains, I think, at that point. So little things like, how do you find the right person? Well, it used to be small enough, you just ask, and they point you.
They were probably sitting next to you.
They point you to this person, and that was the resource. And
Well,
that's not true any longer.
One of
Yeah.
the good places to go and look for help is probably in RSC, where you can chat with other people. That's probably the best place.
Okay, but
Actually,
IRC
the guys
is
there,
really
I have no
intimidating.
idea how to get on.
There's such a
Yeah,
barrier.
IRC
Well,
is
yeah,
not
but
gonna
let
happen.
me-
What is
Well, but why not?
Harry Potter games.
Why not?
Well, you actually, you have to go to Hogwarts first.
Well, it's worse than that, because I actually just had a friend who checked out the IRC and came back, and I wasn't shocked at all, but came back with the typical thing of,
Crying.
oh, they were really, like, very hard on me for
Yeah.
asking questions,
Yes.
because it's very
You
unfriendly.
come back
Okay,
crying.
you can't find it, and then they mean when you.
Okay,
So what
so-
you do is
so-
you tell them to go.
You know,
wait,
I
wait,
would love to
I-
dovetail into an IRC conversation.
wait.
I'm curious.
No, I want to talk about this for a second. I want to, Ed, you said something. You said that the Drupal thing is to speak to the community and that it doesn't work. And I would argue the exact opposite. I mean, I was in business. I've been in business for 6 years now, and for the first at least 3 years, I was completely by myself. Like, I didn't realize I've lived in Massachusetts my whole life. I didn't realize Aquia was in Massachusetts.
Right.
Like, I was that, like, had the blinders on. And I was building some decent sites. You know, I learned a lot. It was all self-taught. Thankfully, I discovered IRC, and it does have a reputation. But I would say that Drupal is actually one of the much more friendly channels. Like, if you go into, I have
Everything's
a
relevant.
thick skin, and I wanted to cry when I went into the Git channel
Yes.
for asking a simple question.
Smackdown.
I was gonna say, try going into the CSS channel.
Git,
I-
Apache,
yeah,
PHP, just,
it's
man, Drupal's
painful.
like great.
Now, Drupal, again, you just have to know who you're talking to and how to ask. It's like any community. You can't just walk in and start blaring your horn. You have to ask intelligently. You have to try to solve the problem yourself and show that you tried to solve the problem.
You have to have
'Cause
patience.
it's not support.
You have to
But-
know which channel to join as well.
Yeah,
There are
that's
topic
important.
channels. So
There's-
there's actually a page. If
There
you
is,
go
yeah.
to drupal.org/IRC,
Yeah.
there's a list of all the channels. You can find
And-
the one that matches your question.
Exactly, and they'll tell you some of the basic guidelines. But I would say that probably the biggest turning point in my professional career was getting involved in the face-to-face community. And you say, well, how do you know who to speak to? How do you know how to ask? It's by meeting people. You know, by going to the Drupal camp in Western Mass, I heard, Jason Palmental, who spoke here, was the keynote speaker.
He speaks at every camp.
Oh yeah, he speaks everywhere. But he was the keynote speaker, and I remember he mentioned that they had a web design book club. I love books. I like the web, so I was like, it's kind of interesting. I figured I'd ask. So I asked if there were any openings. I started joining that, listening.
What Nick's not saying was he was living at Maine at the time, and he moved to Providence to be on the book group. That was a real commitment.
Who? Me? I've always been in Massachusetts. The book club is on Skype, by the way.
But close.
So yeah, you don't have to move. But so I started joining that. That's how I met Stephen, and then a few months later, Stephen invited me to be part of the Talking Drupal podcast. Then I've met several people through that. Just this morning, I was on a hangout with Brian Allendike from Pennsylvania, from Penn State, talking about some REST-WS stuff. So it's like you find out that people have specific skill sets. People are known for something,
Yes.
and then you just reach out to them. And if you're polite, 9 times out of 10, they'll be helpful. Now, there's some people that are so busy that they just can't.
You know
But
what
there's people that take
Yeah.
on.
I find actually really helpful is you can't do it on your Drupal.org, for your groups.drupal.org profile, put up a photo of you that kind of looks like you. Make sure your username is something similar to your real name, so that you go to a meetup, a camp, you meet someone or whatever, and then 3 months later, you post a question in a discussion channel, and I'm reading it. I'm like, oh, God, that's familiar. I think I know that person. I'm totally going to think about this a little bit harder and answer their question because I already have a personal connection with you, so I'm more prone to answer it. And if your IRC name is similar as well, it's like, oh, that sounds familiar. For a while, Ben Melançon's name was a list of Roman numerals. And yes, it was memorable, but first of all, I could never type it, so I'm never going to get a hold of him. And he finally changed it to a shorthand of his last name. But I think that's really important. I'm part of the New Hampshire group, and obviously we're a much smaller state, so it's a very, very tiny group. And everyone has been to one of our location meetups. We have 4 different locations. So that small group really, really helps because of that personal connection. But you can achieve that by going to the self-helps and places like this.
But Michelle, are the profiles on a group page different than the Drupal.org?
Yeah,
At the moment they are.
But you have pictures now on Drupal.org as well.
Yeah.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah,
so that's new.
That's
new.
That's pretty cool.
They're going to be merging and consolidating. But I think, to me, a picture is very, very important.
Fantastic point.
And there's also, I would say there are, outside of the face-to-face, there's 3 or 4 really big Drupal communities. One is for support. One is IRC, which admittedly is difficult to get into. The second is the issue queue. And one way to get help in the issue queue is to, after you post an issue, read through and help somebody else.
Basic web karma.
Yeah. And then the third one is Drupal Stack Exchange. I mean, I used to
really
hate it, but it recently has gotten very, very good.
Doesn't it go through those? So when you say the issue queue, and I look at that page, it's like, okay, God, I've got to read this entire.
I'm going to do
You
a
can
session
search.
at D4D. I'm doing a session on getting started contributing, when the biggest component of that is understanding the issue queue. It's another big glob of, oh my God. And so I'm going to do a whole intro on, like, what does this status mean?
It's ugly.
Why would you choose this? How do you participate correctly? And I think that's the
Core
kind of thing
and
that this
contrib?
community needs to, both. Yeah, I'm going to talk about both. I'm going to talk about
I'd like to mention a 4th channel, which is just a Google search. I've gotten very successful at finding, whatever issue is relevant to my problem by just doing a Google search.
I've seen you do those searches, and it's like I feel like you're Harry Potter just pulling magic out of it.
So if you
read
read
Google, is you slip Google $5 and it gives you the good answers. That's what I've always said.
Yeah.
But can you make the Drupal.org search work?
There is a search,
No, you
not the
do
issue.
site:/Drupal.org and hit search.
Exactly.
So there's also a search interface on Drupal.org, the one on the top right corner. But the issue queue has also its own search interface, but it doesn't work very well because it's not on Solr, and it sometimes gives you
Okay, to be
a
honest,
white
it
space of
doesn't.
that.
If it's a big
But-
module like views, it doesn't work at all.
Right. If
Never
you have too many
mind.
keywords in there, it won't work. So just revert back to Google if you're stuck. Or
Yeah, but you can restrict your search on Google to a particular issue queue.
how do you do that?
What was the
So
second
you
thing
so you do like
said?
site:/, and then you put the domain, but you can if you put the domain like /project/
No,
name of the project
but
/
issues don't have the project name in their URLs.
I thought they did.
No, it's node/90.
I've done
No
it.
matter where issue queue it is.
What
Make
it'll
it
find
front
is actually,
page only.
what it'll find is it'll find the listing page that
Right.
will have it,
Yeah.
and then.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I know I've done it. It is
But you won't have access to the comments.
So, pulling it back a little, you had asked earlier which, I think you said, which is better, like having the broad skill set or the deep skill set. And I think either one can benefit you. Having a deep skill set on something is not good if you are, a solo developer, because that's probably not the only thing you're going to have to do.
Right.
But when you're in a company like Acquia or, Pantheon or one of the big companies, even probably BioRAFT, you probably have people who maybe they have a pretty wide, but they really have something that they know the most, that they understand really well. So make the decision that if you're going to try and be the whole enchilada, then you're going to stay pretty surface, and you're going to need to do these searching, mechanisms. But if you want to learn something and you think this is something I should learn really more about, then make sure that you have some way of being able to support yourself with that, because there's only so much you can do really as a hobby on that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's important in any case to have at least 1 or 2 topics, even if you want to be kind of a generalist, that you're really good at, because otherwise, as a freelancer, you'll always be feeding off the bottom.
Yes,
I'm
yes, it's
actually
important
curious.
to dive in where you find interest
Yeah.
and build your skills there.
How many people here are freelancers where they own their own business? 1, 2, 3.
Own
How
their
many
own
people
business.
work at a company where they could specialize? The rest of us. Oh, that's very interesting. Because for a while, I believe it was the flip side. Everyone I met was a freelancer. And I did spend some time freelancing, and I feel like, you know, there's a project planning skill set. You're interviewing the client, maybe even designer. Sometimes you get handed a PSD. Then there's the site building, and then you have to do some module development, some theming, and oh my gosh, the server's not set up yet. And then you have to do that. And then you launch it at, like, you know, midnight, it's
Yeah.
great, and at 10 a.m.,
It's dead.
yeah. So that was my experience when I freelanced. It was,
Death in the morning?
Nervous
Oh,
laughter
no.
fills the room.
I know, yeah. So I guess the thing that I got a lot of experience by doing that, but I very quickly realized it is impossible for me to be a designer and keep a server up.
Yes.
I personally can't do both. Some people can, but that's a very, very challenging thing. And so I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I'm actually really never going to do either of those. I'm going to bring it in, and I'm going to be, you know, themer and module developer and take those skill sets.
Yeah, you learn that. Like,
Yeah.
in the beginning when you're a freelancer, you get the project and you're like, wow, that's my check. I'm not giving any of this to anybody. I'm doing everything from beginning to end. And then if you're going to be successful, you realize what you just said. You can't do both. I'm on the other end. I like keeping the server running and building the site.
Mhm.
But if you ask me to design it, it's going to be squares and triangles.
I want to see you do triangles in CSS.
The triangle CSS.
No,
we
not
do
CSS.
the-
They're like,
Images.
It's a shift.
It's actually an image
It's an
map
image
of
source
triangles.
tag.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you learn, and I'd say the less successful freelancers look at that and go like, well, I'm going to pay as little as possible, or I'm not going to outsource that. I'm just going to deal with it. But I'd say the more successful ones realize that's a cost of doing business. You find a really good set of freelancers that you can work with, like yourself, or agencies, and then build that into the cost and find out, and then you realize that, you know, the way it looks sells just as much as how it works.
Well, that's what we've done, and we've built a cooperative with Agaric so that we're all worker owners. So we all have overlapping and totally different skill sets. When there does come there hasn't been a job we couldn't handle yet with the three of us, but if something did come along, we would hire someone who was a freelancer to fill in that job. But the point of the community is extending your connections to know people who know other people, because there are always developers looking for small jobs to hand off, a little, you know, something that'll fill in my time when I'm in between these two contracts, etc., or something that could take an expert an hour to do, which might take you a few days of researching to figure out how to do. Building up a connected network, and making this more of a personal thing than just a job or a thing you do. I suggest that you look at that as something really important to doing Drupal.
And I don't know about you guys, but for me it works both ways too. So I find that a lot of the designers that I work with, because they know I can set up servers really well, I can
There you
build
go.
complex sites, when they come across a site, they would much rather be designing than building. If they have budget for it, they'll hire me right
They
back.
hire
So
you.
it's-
Exactly. It works
it
both
works both
ways.
ways.
And that's the reason why companies like Pantheon and Acquia exist and are successful, is because there are a lot more people who want to do Drupal than who want to keep a Drupal server running 24/7, 365 days a year. So to make that infrastructure something that you don't have to worry about is worth a price to a lot of people, and a lot of money to some people. So there are different ends of the spectrum for that as well.
Yes, can I ask the experts a question? And the one thing I would love in the Boston meetup is if we could ask at the end of the question, did that successfully answer the question?
Yes.
Did we answer your question, Ed?
So I do have a question, and I want to be able to say whether or not the question was successfully answered. So I would love to see Drupal start focusing more on comments. I feel like we have so many parts of the thing under control. I feel like the piece that we don't have control over that's really important to me in terms of just generating useful content on a website is the commenting process. And I feel like Drupal just decides that, oh my God, this is never going to really work well. So
It's an
why don't you have a
afterthought.
WordPress site if you're going to worry about comments and just leave us alone.
So what, let me ask this, what is wrong with comments for
Right.
you right now?
Well, I don't. So I was on Pantheon, and I feel I have to outsource the email component of it to ZenGrid.
SendGrid.
And they were wonderful. But it's like, okay, God, it's like another weekend learning something else, and it's like I just want to like turn on the comments, and I want them to start working, but I feel like so I don't know if I should start using Discus. The Open Atrium brilliant platform creates its own node to deal with comments. So I feel like I have these 3 use cases.
Yeah.
And
So
like weekends, I'm supposed to spend learning how to do it. He sells in a shrill voice.
that's that's very much a combination of which distros and which pieces you're using, as well as which hosting. Pantheon's emphasis is on their scalable, quick architecture that's really built around the website portion of it. So they've basically said we're going to make sure we do as good a job as possible. We're going to outsource our mail, and go through other ways of doing it. So Acquia handles it differently. You'd actually be able to just set it up and start sending mail the way, your comments would go out as mail the way you probably expect. But that's one of the reasons, probably why we're more expensive for a lot of things,
Well, that's good to know, though. But then what about using that process with Acquia versus outsourcing comments to Discus?
Right. So a lot of our larger companies do outsource to Discus, and one of the reasons why is because when you